The sound of gunfire ripped through the crisp morning air, shattering the quiet that had settled over the rolling hills of the Montana Territory. Hannah Davis stood on her porch, rifle clutched in both hands, eyes narrowed against the rising sun as she tracked the movement of riders approaching her property line. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her hands remained steady. This was her land, and she'd be damned if anyone was going to take it from her. The year was 1875, 3 years after Hannah had buried her father beneath the old oak tree that stood sentinel at the edge of their modest ranch outside of Bannack, Montana. At 24, she'd learned to survive on her own, tending to the cattle, mending fences, and keeping predators both animal and human at bay. But the men who circled her property like vultures were a different kind of threat altogether. This is private property. She shouted, firing another warning shot into the air. I suggest you turn around before I aim lower. The 3 riders halted their horses, exchanging glances before the largest of them, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache, called back. This ain't gonna be your land much longer, Miss Davis. The railroad's coming through and you're sitting on valuable property. Be smart and take our offer. Hannah's jaw clenched. Your offer wouldn't buy me passage out of the territory, let alone a new start. This land is mine, fair and square, and I'm not selling. The men laughed, a harsh sound that carried across the open range. Women don't run ranches, the leader sneered. You'll be begging to sell by winter. They turned their horses, but not before the leader pointed a threatening finger in her direction. We'll be back, Miss Davis, and next time we won't be so polite. Hannah watched them go, the rifle still braced against her shoulder. Only when they disappeared over the ridge did she lower the weapon, allowing herself a moment of trembling release. They would be back, she knew, and she couldn't hold them off forever. Not alone. Miles away, a lone rider guided his horse along the meandering trail that led to Bannack. Matthew Stone adjusted his hat against the glare of the midday sun, his eyes scanning the horizon out of habit. At 32, he'd spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it, drifting from one cow outfit to another, from Texas to Kansas to Montana. His latest stint had ended abruptly, when the ranch owner had sold to a mining company, leaving Matthew once again in search of work. He'd heard Bannack was growing, that ranches were springing up across the territory now that the gold rush had settled. A man with his skills could find honest work there, maybe even save enough to stake a claim of his own someday. It was a dream he'd carried for years, tucked away beneath the practicalities of survival. His horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Scout, perked his ears at something in the distance. Matthew followed the animal's gaze, spotting a thin column of smoke rising against the clear blue sky. Smoke meant people, and people might mean information about work or trouble. Either way, it warranted investigation. What do you say, Scout? Matthew patted the horse's neck. Should we take a look? He altered his course, guiding Scout toward the smoke. As they crested a gentle hill, Matthew saw a modest ranch spread out before him, a small cabin with a barn and corral, a garden patch, and beyond that, grazing cattle dotting the landscape. It was the kind of place he'd always imagined for himself. Simple, self-sufficient, a home, but something was wrong. Even from this distance, Matthew could see the broken fence posts and the scorch marks on the side of the barn. As he drew closer, he heard a woman's voice, sharp with anger. Get off my land, I've told you for the last time. Matthew slowed Scout to a walk, approaching cautiously. Through a gap in the trees, he saw her, a woman with a rifle, facing down 2 mounted men. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, whipping around her face in the wind, but her stance was unwavering. Be reasonable, Miss Davis, one of the men was saying. A woman can't run a ranch alone. It's just a matter of time before you fail, and when you do, you'll get nothing. Take our money now. Your money, she scoffed. Half of what my land is worth. I know what you're doing. You're buying up everything for the railroad, making a fortune while cheating honest folk out of their homes. The second man slid from his saddle, taking a menacing step toward her. Maybe you need a demonstration of what happens to stubborn women in these parts. Matthew had seen enough. He urged Scout forward, emerging from the tree line with his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. Afternoon, gentlemen, he called, his voice carrying across the yard. Seems to me the lady's made her position clear. All eyes turned to him. The woman's expression registered surprise, then suspicion. The men's faces hardened with annoyance. "This doesn't concern you, stranger," the first man said. "Keep riding." Matthew dismounted, tying Scout to a nearby post before approaching. He walked with the easy confidence of a man who knew how to handle himself. "Well now, I was hoping to ask about work in these parts, but I can't help noticing you gentlemen seem to be causing this lady some distress." The woman's eyes narrowed. "I don't need help." "Never said you did," Matthew replied without taking his eyes off the men. "But I do believe in fair play, and 2 against 1 doesn't seem particularly sporting." The second man, still on foot, spat on the ground. "You're outnumbered too, Cowboy." Matthew smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Am I? Because from where I'm standing, I see a capable woman with a rifle and myself. That makes 2 of us and 2 of you. Seems even to me." A tense silence followed, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the grass. Finally, the first man jerked his head at his companion. "Come on, Earl, we've got other business today." He fixed Matthew with a hard stare. "You'd be wise to mind your own affairs in this territory, stranger." Matthew touched the brim of his hat. "I'll keep that in mind." The men mounted up and rode off, dust billowing behind them. Only when they were well away did Matthew turn to the woman, who still hadn't lowered her rifle. "You can point that somewhere else now, madam," he said. "I mean you no harm. Who are you?" she demanded. "And what are you really doing on my land?" "Name's Matthew Stone. I was headed to Bannack looking for work when I saw the smoke." He gestured toward the barn. "Looks like you've had some trouble." She hesitated, then slowly lowered the rifle. "Hannah Davis." "And yes, I've had trouble, as you put it. Those men work for Wilson Prescott. He's buying up land for the railroad, and he's not particular about how he gets it." Matthew glanced at the scorched barn wall. "Appears he's willing to go to extreme measures." "That was last night," Hannah said, her voice tight. "I managed to put it out before it spread, but—" She faltered, and for a moment he saw the exhaustion and fear she'd been concealing. "You're alone here?" Matthew asked. "My father died 3 years ago." "I've managed just fine on my own until Prescott decided he wanted my land." She straightened her shoulders. "I don't need a savior, Mr. Stone." "I'm not offering to be one," he replied, "but it looks like you could use an extra pair of hands to fix that barn, and I am looking for work." Hannah studied him, weighing suspicion against necessity. Finally, she sighed. "I can't pay much. Room, board, and fair wages for fair work is all I ask," Matthew said. "I'm good with cattle and better with repairs. I can help you get this place secure again." She nodded slowly. 1 week. "Then we'll see." 1 week it is. As Hannah led him toward the barn to assess the damage, Matthew couldn't help but admire her determination. She walked with purpose, her back straight despite the visible weight of her circumstances. He'd met men who'd crumbled under far less pressure. "The fire didn't reach the interior," Hannah explained, pushing open the barn door. "But those support beams will need replacing, and I've been meaning to mend the roof before winter." Matthew surveyed the damage. "I can handle that. What about your cattle? How many head are you running?" 43, she answered. "It's not much, but it's been enough to get by. My father built this place from nothing." "It's a fine spread," Matthew said honestly. "He'd be proud you're fighting for it." Something in Hannah's expression softened momentarily before she masked it. "Well, Mr. Stone, if you're staying, you might as well put your horse in the corral and get settled. There's a small bunkhouse behind the main cabin. It's not much, but it'll be fine," he assured her. "I've slept under the stars more nights than I can count. A roof of any kind is luxury." As Hannah watched him lead Scout toward the corral, she tried to quiet the voice in her head that warned against trusting a stranger who appeared out of nowhere just when she needed help. But another voice, one that sounded suspiciously like her father's, reminded her that sometimes help came in unexpected forms, and only a fool refused it out of pride. Besides, she thought as she observed Matthew's capable movements as he tended to his horse, there was something about him that didn't fit the mold of Prescott's hired men. His eyes were clear and direct, without the shifty calculation she'd come to recognize in the men who worked for the land baron. And he'd stood up to Prescott's men without hesitation, placing himself squarely on her side without even knowing the full situation. Hannah shook her head, forcing herself back to practicality. 1 week, she'd told him. 1 week to prove himself trustworthy. After that, she'd decide whether his help was worth the risk of having a stranger so close to her home. What she didn't anticipate was how quickly 1 week would change everything. The first few days established a cautious rhythm. Hannah rose before dawn, as always, to milk the cow and gather eggs from the chicken coop. She'd expected to find Matthew still asleep, but each morning he was already at work mending fences, reinforcing the barn's damaged wall, or tending to the horses. By the time she returned to the house to prepare breakfast, he had completed chores that would have taken her hours. On the third day, as they sat on the porch eating a simple meal of cornbread and coffee, Hannah finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. "Where are you from, Mr. Stone?" Matthew took a sip of coffee before answering. "Originally, a small farm outside of St. Louis, but I haven't called anywhere home for a long time." "What brought you west?" "Same as most, I suppose. Opportunity, adventure." He smiled slightly. A young man's restlessness. And now, he considered her question, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. "Now I'm thinking a man can only wander so long before he starts to wonder what he's looking for." Hannah nodded, understanding more than she let on. "My father came here for the gold rush, found enough to buy this land but not enough to make him rich. He always said the real treasure was the life he built." "Sounds like a wise man," Matthew remarked. He was. Hannah stood, gathering their empty plates. "We should get to work." "I need to move the cattle to the north pasture today." Matthew's eyebrows rose. "All 43 head, just the two of us." For the first time since he'd arrived, Hannah smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "I've done it alone before. With 2 of us, it should be easy." It wasn't easy, but it was exhilarating. Hannah rode with the confidence of someone who had grown up in the saddle, guiding her sorrel mare with subtle shifts of weight rather than excessive rein work. Matthew matched her skill, anticipating the cattle's movements and heading off potential strays before they could break from the herd. By mid-afternoon, the cattle were settled in the fresh pasture, grazing contentedly under the Montana sky. Hannah dismounted near a small stream, letting her mare drink while she stretched her legs. Matthew joined her, his own mount nickering softly as it lowered its head to the water. "You ride well," Hannah commented, surprising herself with the compliment. "So do you," he returned. "Most ranch owners I've worked for couldn't handle their herds half as well." "I'm not most ranch owners." "No," Matthew agreed, his eyes meeting hers. "You certainly aren't." Something in his gaze made Hannah look away, suddenly conscious of how close they were standing, of the fact that they were alone miles from the ranch house. She busied herself adjusting her mare's bridle, grateful when Matthew changed the subject. "Tell me about Prescott and the railroad," he said. "How long has he been pressuring you to sell?" Hannah sighed, her momentary discomfort forgotten as the familiar worry resurfaced. "About 6 months. At first, it was just offers, fair ones even. But when I refused, the offers got worse and the tactics got aggressive. Fences cut, cattle spooked, and now this fire." "Have you reported it to the sheriff?" She laughed without humor. "Sheriff Thompson, he's in Prescott's pocket. When I complained about the harassment, he suggested I consider my position as a woman alone and take the offer." Matthew frowned. "That's not right." "Not much is right when money's involved," Hannah said bitterly. "Prescott needs my land because it contains the only viable pass through the mountains for the railroad. Without it, they'd have to go 20 miles north, which would cost them a fortune. He's already bought everyone else out, some willingly, others through methods like what you've seen." "And you're the last holdout," Hannah nodded. "My father's buried here. This land was his dream, his legacy to me. I won't let them take it." Matthew was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You need allies, Miss Davis, people in town who might stand with you against Prescott." Easier said than done. Most folks either work for him or are afraid of him. He owns the bank, half the businesses in Bannack, and apparently the law. Not everyone can be in his pocket, Matthew insisted. There must be others who resent his control. Hannah considered this. Perhaps. The blacksmith, Mr. Jenkins, has no love for Prescott. And the widow who runs the general store, Mrs. Parker, she's turned down his offers to buy her out several times. "That's a start," Matthew said. Tomorrow, I'll ride into town for supplies. Might be worth taking the temperature of the place, seeing who else might be sympathetic to your cause. Hannah wanted to protest that it wasn't his fight, but the truth was, she needed help. And for reasons she wasn't ready to examine too closely, she was beginning to trust Matthew Stone. All right, she agreed, but be careful, Prescott has eyes everywhere. Matthew's smile was warm and reassuring. I can be discreet when necessary, Miss Davis. Hannah, she said suddenly. If we're going to be allies in this, you might as well call me Hannah. His smile widened. Hannah it is. And I'm Matthew. They mounted up and began the ride back to the ranch, a companionable silence between them. As they crested the final hill that overlooked her property, Hannah felt a small spark of hope ignite within her chest. For the first time in months, she wasn't facing her battles alone. The next morning, Matthew rode into Bannack with a list of supplies and a mission to gauge the town's sentiment toward Wilson Prescott. The settlement was larger than he'd expected, with a main street lined with wooden buildings that housed everything from a saloon to a proper hotel, signs of prosperity that spoke to the area's transition from mining camp to established town. Matthew's first stop was the general store, where he introduced himself to the widow Parker, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who sized him up with a single glance. "You're working for Hannah Davis, then?" she asked as she gathered the items on his list. "Word travels fast," Matthew observed. Mrs. Parker snorted. In a town this size, a man breathing too loud is news by supper time. Hannah's one of the few who treats me fair, doesn't try to haggle me down to nothing or act like I don't know my business because I'm a woman. She lowered her voice. Heard there was trouble out at her place. Fire, Matthew nodded. Small one, we've got it under control. She repeated, a knowing look in her eyes. Well, it's about time that girl had some help. Been worried sick about her ever since Prescott set his sights on her land. She leaned closer. You want some free advice, young man? Watch yourself. Prescott doesn't take kindly to interference. I've gathered that, Matthew said. Seems he has quite a grip on this town. Not as tight as he thinks, Mrs. Parker replied. There are more than a few of us who remember Bannack before Prescott arrived with his money and his plans. We're not all eager to see it turned into some railroad hub that'll be bustling with strangers. You know others who might feel that way. Mrs. Parker studied him for a moment before making a decision. Jenkins at the smithy, for one, Doc Miller, the Reverend Simmons. We're not many, but we're not nobody either. She finished wrapping his purchases. You tell Hannah she's not alone, and you be careful riding back. Prescott's men have been known to make the roads dangerous for those who cross him. Matthew thanked her and headed for the blacksmith's shop. Jenkins proved equally forthcoming once he understood Matthew was helping Hannah. By midday, Matthew had spoken to several townspeople who shared their resentment of Prescott's growing influence. None were powerful enough to stand against him individually, but together, they represented a potential coalition that might at least draw attention to Prescott's tactics. His final stop was the saloon, where he hoped to gather information by listening rather than asking direct questions. The Frontier Saloon was half full despite the early hour, with a mix of cowboys, miners, and what appeared to be railroad men judging by their attire. Matthew ordered a whiskey and found a quiet corner from which to observe. He didn't have to wait long before hearing Prescott's name. Two well-dressed men at a nearby table were discussing business loud enough for their conversation to carry. Prescott's getting impatient, the older of the two said. The investors want to see progress, and that Davis woman is holding everything up. He should have handled it months ago, the younger man replied. Paid her off or scared her off. Now the whole situation's becoming a liability. That's why I'm here. The older man lowered his voice, but Matthew could still make out his words. Prescott wants it resolved by the end of the month, one way or another. The main office is sending additional men to ensure it happens. Matthew finished his drink, leaving money on the table before slipping out of the saloon. The conversation confirmed what he'd suspected. Prescott was escalating, and Hannah was running out of time. As he rode back to the ranch, Matthew's mind raced with everything he'd learned. There were people in town willing to support Hannah, but would it be enough? And what did one way or another mean for her safety? He urged Scout into a faster pace, suddenly anxious to return. He found Hannah in the garden, dirt smudging her cheeks as she harvested vegetables for dinner. She straightened when she saw him, shielding her eyes against the sun. "You're back earlier than I expected," she said. "Did you get everything we needed?" Matthew dismounted, leading Scout toward the stable. "That and more. We need to talk, Hannah." Her expression grew serious as she followed him. "What happened?" While he unsaddled his horse, Matthew recounted everything he'd heard in town, including the conversation at the saloon. Hannah listened without interruption, her face growing paler with each word. "End of the month," she repeated when he'd finished. "That's less than 2 weeks away." "I spoke with several people who might stand with you," Matthew said. "Mrs. Parker, Jenkins, others. They resent Prescott's control as much as you do." Hannah shook her head. "What can they do against men willing to burn property and threaten violence? I won't put others at risk." "They're already at risk," Matthew argued gently. "Prescott won't stop with your land. Today it's the railroad, tomorrow it'll be something else. This town is worth fighting for, Hannah, and the people I spoke to know that." She was quiet for a long moment, absently stroking Scout's neck. "Even if you're right, what can we do in 2 weeks?" "We make a stand," Matthew said. "We gather those who oppose Prescott, bring attention to his methods. The railroad company may want your land, but they won't want the bad publicity that comes with violence and intimidation. If enough people speak out, Hannah interrupted, "they'll just send more men to force me out, and anyone who stands with me will suffer." Matthew stepped closer, his voice earnest. "I won't let that happen." Hannah looked up at him, searching his face. "Why are you doing this, Matthew?" "This isn't your fight. You could ride on, find work elsewhere, leave all this trouble behind." It was a fair question, one Matthew had asked himself more than once over the past few days. The answer had become increasingly clear to him, though he wasn't sure Hannah was ready to hear it. "I've been drifting a long time," he said carefully. "Taking jobs, moving on when they ended, never putting down roots. It's a lonely way to live." He met her gaze steadily. "When I saw you standing up to those men, defending what's yours with everything you had, it reminded me of what courage looks like. Made me think maybe some things are worth fighting for." Hannah's expression softened, vulnerability showing through the determined facade she usually maintained. "You hardly know me." "I know enough," Matthew replied. "I know you're strong and stubborn and braver than most men I've met. I know you love this land not just because it's yours, but because of what it represents, your father's dream, your home, and I know I want to help you keep it." For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of feelings neither was ready to name. Then Hannah broke the connection, turning back to practical matters. "If we're going to do this, we need a plan," she said. "Something better than just hoping for support from townspeople who are scared of Prescott." Matthew nodded, respecting her shift in focus. "I've been thinking about that. First, we document everything: the fence cutting, the fire, the threats. We gather statements from anyone who's witnessed Prescott's men harassing you. Then we send letters to the territorial governor, the newspapers in Helena and Butte, even the railroad's head office. You think they'll care?" "Railroads care about their reputation, especially now when they're trying to convince communities to welcome them. If word gets out that they're employing thugs to steal land from a woman defending her father's legacy." He let the implications hang in the air. Hannah considered this. "It could work, but Prescott will retaliate before any help comes. Which is why we don't wait to act," Matthew said. "Tomorrow, we ride into town together. We meet with those who might support you, form an alliance. Show Prescott this isn't just about one stubborn rancher anymore, it's about the future of Bannack itself." Hannah's lips curved into a small, determined smile. "All right, Cowboy, let's try it your way." That night, after a simple dinner, they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. The air had grown cooler, carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains. Hannah had brought out a quilt, which she now draped over her shoulders against the chill. "Tell me something," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. "If this works, if we manage to keep Prescott from taking my land, what will you do next?" Matthew leaned back in his chair, considering. "Hadn't thought that far ahead." "Yes, you have," Hannah challenged. "A man like you always has a plan," he chuckled. "A man like me, resourceful, careful." You don't strike me as someone who leaves much to chance. Matthew conceded with a nod. Fair enough, truth is, I've been saving to buy land of my own, not much yet, but enough for a start if I found the right place. He glanced at her. What about you? If you keep the ranch, what then? Hannah pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. I keep working, keep building what my father started. It's been hard alone, but… She hesitated. It's the only future I've allowed myself to imagine. No thoughts of marriage, family. Her laugh held a touch of bitterness. Not many suitable prospects in Bannack, especially for a woman who insists on running her own affairs. Most men want a wife who'll defer to their judgment, not challenge it. Sounds like you've met the wrong kind of men, Matthew said quietly. Hannah glanced at him, then quickly away. Perhaps. Another silence fell between them, this one charged with possibilities neither was ready to voice. Finally, Hannah stood, gathering the quilt around her. We should rest, she said. Tomorrow will be a long day. Matthew rose as well. Hannah, he said, stopping her before she reached the door. Whatever happens, I want you to know I'm glad I found your ranch that day. In the dim light of the porch lantern, he saw her expression soften. So am I, she admitted. Good night, Matthew. Good night, Hannah. As Matthew walked to the bunkhouse, he acknowledged to himself what he'd been reluctant to admit. His interest in Hannah's fight had become deeply personal. In just a few days, she had awoken something in him he'd thought long buried, a desire for connection, for purpose beyond the next job or the next town. He wasn't just fighting for her land anymore, he was fighting for a chance at something he'd never expected to find on the Montana frontier. The next morning dawned clear and cool, promising a perfect autumn day. Hannah dressed with more care than usual, selecting a clean blouse and her best riding skirt, practical for the saddle but presentable enough for town. As she pinned her hair, she caught herself wondering what Matthew would think, then immediately chided herself for the girlish thought. Today wasn't about impressing a handsome cowboy, it was about saving her ranch. Still, when she emerged from the cabin to find Matthew waiting with their horses saddled, she couldn't help noticing he'd also made an effort with his appearance. His shirt was freshly washed, his face clean-shaven, and his dark hair neatly combed beneath his hat. Ready? He asked, handing her the reins to her mare. Hannah nodded, mounting up with practiced ease. As I'll ever be. They rode toward Bannack side by side, discussing their strategy. They would start with Mrs. Parker, then visit the blacksmith and others who might sympathize with their cause. By day's end, they hoped to have enough support to make Prescott think twice before escalating his tactics further. The town was bustling when they arrived, wagons and riders moving along the main street as businesses conducted their daily trade. Hannah felt eyes turning toward them as they rode in. A woman and a man, clearly together, was always cause for notice in a frontier town. But she held her head high, refusing to be intimidated by curiosity or judgment. Their first stop was the general store, where Mrs. Parker greeted them warmly. Hannah Davis, it's been too long since you've come to town, she said, embracing Hannah before turning to Matthew. And Mr. Stone, back so soon. We're here on important business, Mrs. Parker, Hannah said, lowering her voice despite the empty store. Matthew tells me you might be willing to help us stand against Prescott. The older woman's expression turned serious. Indeed, I am. That man has been squeezing this town dry for years, and I'm not the only one who's had enough of it. She gestured for them to follow her to the back room. Come, we can speak more freely here. Over the next hour, Mrs. Parker outlined the growing resentment toward Prescott among certain townspeople. His control of the bank meant he could call in loans at will, forcing business owners to comply with his wishes or face ruin. His influence with the sheriff left many without recourse when his men caused trouble. But people are reaching their breaking point, Mrs. Parker explained. Jenkins refused to shoe Prescott's horses last week after they deliberately damaged his fence. Doc Miller treated one of Prescott's men when he got hurt intimidating a farmer, then charged him triple the usual rate. Small acts of defiance, but they're spreading. We need more than small acts, Hannah said. Prescott plans to force me off my land by the end of the month. I need people willing to speak up, to bear witness to what he's doing. Mrs. Parker nodded thoughtfully. Wait here. She left them for several minutes, returning with a middle-aged man Hannah recognized as the town's newspaper editor, Henry Collins. His small weekly publication, the Bannock Herald, was hardly influential, but it was the only newspaper for 50 miles. "Mr. Collins," Mrs. Parker said, "these are the folks I mentioned." Collins extended his hand to Matthew, then Hannah. "Mrs. Parker says you have a story about Wilson Prescott that needs telling." Hannah exchanged a glance with Matthew before addressing the editor. "I do, Mr. Collins. It's about illegal tactics to force landowners to sell, about threats and property damage, and about a railroad using a man like Prescott to do their dirty work." Collins's eyebrows rose. "Those are serious accusations, Miss Davis." "They're true," Matthew interjected. "I've witnessed some of it myself, and there are others who can corroborate parts of Hannah's story." The editor pulled out a small notebook. "Tell me everything from the beginning." For the next hour, Hannah recounted the escalating pressure from Prescott, the initial fair offers that turned to threats, the mysterious accidents that befell her property, and finally the fire. Matthew added his own observations, including what he'd overheard in the saloon. Collins took detailed notes, occasionally asking for clarification but mostly listening intently. When they finished, he closed his notebook with a thoughtful expression. "Publishing this would make powerful enemies," he said carefully. "Prescott advertises in my paper, and the railroad has promised significant business once construction begins." Hannah's heart sank. Even here, Prescott's influence would silence them, but Collins surprised her. "However," he continued, "I became a journalist to tell the truth, not to be another man's mouthpiece. If you can bring me one more credible witness to Prescott's intimidation tactics, I'll run the story in next week's edition." Hope surged within Hannah. "I think we can manage that." Collins nodded, rising to his feet. "Good, and I suggest you also seek out Judge Harmon. He's new to the territory, appointed directly by the governor. Prescott hasn't had time to influence him yet." This was unexpected good fortune. "Judge Harmon is here in Bannock?" Matthew asked. "Arrived last week to establish the territorial circuit court," Collins confirmed. "He's staying at the hotel, a fair man by all accounts and not easily intimidated." After Collins left, Mrs. Parker squeezed Hannah's hand encouragingly. "This is a good start, dear. Now, you should visit Jenkins next. He has his own story to tell about Prescott's methods." The blacksmith proved even more eager to help than Mrs. Parker had suggested. James Jenkins was a mountain of a man with hands like sledgehammers and a deep-seated resentment of Wilson Prescott. "He tried to burn me out last year when I refused to sell my shop," Jenkins told them as he worked his forge. "Claimed it was an accident, but I know better. Since then, he sent his business elsewhere and encouraged others to do the same." The blacksmith smiled grimly. "But I'm the best smith for 50 miles, and he knows it. People still come, no matter what he says." "Would you be willing to make a statement to the newspaper?" Hannah asked. "Or to Judge Harmon, if necessary?" Jenkins hammered a red-hot piece of metal, sparks flying. "Miss Davis, I'd testify before the territorial governor himself if it meant seeing Prescott get what's coming to him." By mid-afternoon, Hannah and Matthew had spoken with several more townspeople who offered their support. Some had their own stories of Prescott's intimidation, while others simply resented his growing control over Bannock's future. Not everyone was willing to speak publicly, but enough had agreed that Hannah began to feel a genuine sense of hope. Their final stop was the hotel, where they hoped to arrange a meeting with Judge Harmon. The lobby was quiet when they entered, with only the clerk behind the desk and a well-dressed older man reading a newspaper in a corner chair. "We'd like to inquire about meeting with Judge Harmon," Matthew said to the clerk. "It's a matter of some urgency." Before the clerk could respond, the man with the newspaper looked up. "I'm Judge Harmon," he said, setting aside his reading material. "And you are?" Matthew introduced himself and Hannah, explaining they had a legal matter to discuss regarding land rights and coercive tactics by a local businessman. The judge listened attentively, then gestured to the chairs near him. "Please sit. Tell me more about this situation." For the third time that day, Hannah recounted her story, with Matthew adding his observations. Judge Harmon asked pointed questions about dates, specifics of the threats, and whether she had any documentation of the original purchase of her land. "I have all my father's papers at the ranch," Hannah assured him. "The deed is clear and free of any encumbrances." The judge nodded. "Bring those documents to me tomorrow. I'll also need sworn statements from these witnesses you've mentioned." He frowned thoughtfully. "If what you've told me is accurate, Miss Davis, this goes beyond civil harassment into criminal intimidation and attempted arson. These are serious offenses." "The sheriff hasn't been willing to investigate," Hannah said carefully. "Yes, I've heard concerns about Sheriff Thompson's selective enforcement," Judge Harmon replied dryly. "Rest assured, the territorial court operates independently of local influences." As they left the hotel, Hannah felt lighter than she had in months. For the first time since Prescott had set his sights on her ranch, she had allies and a plan. "This went better than I dared hope," she admitted as they untied their horses. "I never thought so many would be willing to stand with me." Matthew smiled. "People respect courage, Hannah. You standing your ground alone inspired others to find their own backbone." She was about to respond when she noticed his expression change, his gaze focusing on something over her shoulder. Hannah turned to see Wilson Prescott himself approaching, flanked by two men she recognized as the ones who had threatened her at the ranch. Prescott was a tall, imposing figure in an expensive suit, his silver hair and beard impeccably groomed. His smile didn't reach his cold eyes as he stopped before them. "Miss Davis," he said, tipping his hat. "What a pleasant surprise to see you in town, and with company no less." His gaze shifted to Matthew. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Matthew Stone," Matthew replied evenly, not offering his hand. "Mr. Stone." Prescott's smile tightened. "I understand you've taken employment with Miss Davis, a brave decision considering the circumstances." Hannah stepped forward, placing herself slightly between the men. "What do you want, Prescott?" "Merely to extend my greetings," he said smoothly. "And perhaps to inquire if you've reconsidered my offer. The railroad grows impatient, Miss Davis. They expect progress." "My answer hasn't changed," Hannah replied firmly. "The ranch isn't for sale, not to you, not to the railroad, not to anyone." Prescott's facade of cordiality slipped momentarily, revealing the hard man beneath. "I had hoped you might see reason, especially after recent incidents. It would be a shame if further misfortunes were to befall your property." Matthew's hand moved to rest casually near his sidearm. "That sounds remarkably like a threat, Mr. Prescott." "Not at all," Prescott replied, his smile returning. "Merely an observation that managing a ranch alone is fraught with dangers. Accidents happen." "I'm not alone anymore," Hannah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And accidents have a way of finding those who cause them in the end." Prescott's eyes narrowed, but he maintained his composed exterior. "Indeed they do." He glanced between them, assessing. "Well, I won't keep you further. Good day, Miss Davis, Mr. Stone. I'm sure we'll speak again soon." As Prescott and his men walked away, Hannah released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "He knows something's happening," she whispered. "He'll try to stop us." Matthew nodded, his expression grim, "which is why we need to move quickly. Let's get those statements from Jenkins and the others today, before word spreads too far." They spent the next hour collecting written testimonies from those willing to stand against Prescott. By the time they were ready to head back to the ranch, the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains. "We should return tomorrow with your father's papers," Matthew said as they mounted their horses. "The sooner Judge Harmon has everything he needs, the better." Hannah agreed, though anxiety had begun to replace her earlier optimism. The confrontation with Prescott had made the danger of their situation painfully clear. He wouldn't surrender easily, and his resources far outmatched theirs. They rode in silence for a while, each lost in thought. The evening was peaceful, the landscape painted in the golden hues of sunset. Under different circumstances, Hannah might have found it beautiful. "You're worried," Matthew observed, breaking the silence. Hannah nodded. "Prescott won't take this lying down. He has too much at stake." "We've done more today than he expected," Matthew reminded her. "He thought you were alone, isolated. Now he knows that's not true." "It may not be enough," Hannah said quietly. "If he's desperate enough, legal complaints and newspaper articles won't stop him." Matthew guided his horse closer to hers. "Then we'll be ready," he promised. "Whatever comes, Hannah, you don't face it alone anymore." The conviction in his voice warmed something deep inside her. This man who had appeared on her land less than a week ago had somehow become essential to her fight, and perhaps to more than that, though she wasn't ready to examine those feelings too closely. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." They crested the final hill before her property, and Hannah's words died in her throat. Below them, smoke billowed from the direction of the ranch house, thick and black against the evening sky. "No," she gasped, spurring her mare forward. Matthew was right beside her as they galloped toward the ranch, fear propelling them at a dangerous pace. As they drew closer, the extent of the damage became horrifyingly clear. The barn was fully engulfed in flames, and fire had spread to one side of the main house. The bunkhouse appeared untouched, but the corral fence had been broken in several places, the cattle nowhere in sight. Hannah leapt from her horse before it had fully stopped, running toward the house. Matthew caught her arm, pulling her back. "Wait, it's not safe, my father's papers." She cried. "They're in the house." Without them, understanding flashed in Matthew's eyes. "Where exactly?" "The desk in the main room, bottom drawer," Hannah said, struggling against his grip. "Matthew, please." He released her, but only to remove his coat and soak it in the water trough nearby. "Stay here," he ordered, wrapping the wet garment around his face and shoulders. "If I'm not out in 2 minutes, get help." Before she could protest, he was running toward the house, ducking low beneath the smoke. Hannah watched in terror as he disappeared inside, seconds stretching into an eternity as she waited. The fire crackled and roared, consuming the barn and working its way steadily across the roof of the main house. Just when she was about to follow him, Matthew emerged, coughing violently, a wooden box clutched against his chest. Hannah ran to him, supporting his weight as he stumbled away from the burning building. "Got them," he rasped, presenting the box to her. "All your father's papers." Hannah took the box with trembling hands, tears blurring her vision. "You could have been killed." Matthew's response was cut off by another fit of coughing. When he recovered enough to speak, his voice was rough but determined. "We need to save what we can and get the fire under control." For the next several hours, they fought the fire with every means available: water from the well, dirt, blankets soaked in the trough. By the time they managed to extinguish the last of the flames, night had fallen completely, and both were exhausted beyond measure. The barn was a total loss. The house had fared better. The fire had consumed one bedroom and part of the roof, but the main room and kitchen remained intact, if smoke damaged. The bunkhouse, situated farther from the other buildings, had escaped the flames entirely. Hannah sat on a stump near the smoldering remains of the barn, the box of papers clutched to her chest. Her face was streaked with soot, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. Matthew approached cautiously, offering a cup of water from the well. "Drink," he said gently. "You need it." She accepted the cup with a murmured thanks, taking a long sip before speaking. "This was Prescott's answer," she said, her voice hollow, "to what we did today." Matthew nodded grimly. "Seems likely. The timing is too convenient to be coincidence." "He could have killed us if we'd been here," Hannah said, the realization sending a chill through her despite the lingering heat from the fire. "Or if we'd returned a little later, we might have lost everything: the house, the papers, any chance of fighting back." "But we didn't," Matthew reminded her, kneeling beside her. "The papers are safe, the house can be repaired, and now we have absolute proof of what Prescott is willing to do." Hannah looked up at him, her expression fierce despite her exhaustion. "I won't let him win," she said, "not after this." "No," Matthew agreed, "we won't." He helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed slightly. "You should rest. The bunkhouse is untouched. You can sleep there tonight. I'll keep watch." Hannah shook her head. "The house is still sound enough. I won't be driven from my home." She hesitated, then added, "But I'd feel safer if you stayed close. There's a sofa in the main room." Matthew understood what it cost her to make such a request. "I'll be there," he assured her. "No one will harm you while I'm around, Hannah, that's a promise." In the smoke-scented darkness of the damaged house, Hannah sat at the kitchen table while Matthew cleaned a cut on her hand she hadn't even noticed receiving. The tenderness with which he wrapped the small wound made her heart ache in a way that had nothing to do with the day's trauma. "Why are you still here?" she asked suddenly. "After all this, the threats, the fire, you could leave, find safer work elsewhere." Matthew finished securing the bandage before meeting her gaze. "Do you want me to leave?" "No," Hannah admitted, the word barely audible. "But I need to understand why you'd risk so much for a stranger's fight." Matthew was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "When I first saw you, standing on your porch with that rifle, refusing to back down despite the odds, something changed for me." He smiled slightly. "I've spent years drifting, working ranches across 4 territories, never staying anywhere long enough to feel like I belonged. But here, helping you fight for this place, it matters in a way nothing has for a long time." He took her bandaged hand in his touch gentle. "You're not a stranger to me anymore, Hannah, and this isn't just your fight now. It's ours." The intensity in his eyes made Hannah's breath catch. No man had ever looked at her that way before, like she was something precious and strong all at once. Without thinking, she leaned forward, closing the distance between them until their lips met in a kiss that started tentatively but quickly deepened with shared emotion. When they finally pulled apart, Matthew's expression was a mixture of surprise and wonder. "I've been wanting to do that since the day I met you," he confessed. Hannah smiled, the first genuine smile since they'd discovered the fire. "I'm glad you waited until I wasn't pointing a rifle at you." He laughed, the sound chasing away some of the darkness that hung over the damaged house. "A wise decision on my part." The moment of lightness faded as reality reasserted itself. Tomorrow they would need to assess the full extent of the damage, round up the scattered cattle, and take the salvaged papers to Judge Harmon. The fight was far from over. As if reading her thoughts, Matthew squeezed her hand gently. "One day at a time," he said. "Tonight we rest. Tomorrow we rebuild and fight back." Hannah nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. "Together, together," he agreed. Dawn revealed the full extent of the damage in harsh clarity. The barn was nothing but charred timbers and ash. The house roof would need significant repairs before the first snow fell. Most of the cattle had fled the fire, scattering across the surrounding pastures. After a quick breakfast of coffee and what food remained unspoiled, Hannah and Matthew rode out to begin the process of rounding up the herd. It was slow, painstaking work, made more difficult by the animals' lingering fear from the fire. By midday, they had recovered only 27 of the 43 head. "We should take a break," Matthew suggested as they guided the recovered cattle into the intact portion of the corral. "Get something to eat, then head to town with those papers." Hannah nodded, too tired to argue despite her desire to find the remaining cattle. The papers were the priority now. Without legal protection, she might not have a ranch left to stock with cattle. They ate a simple meal in silence, both lost in thought about the challenges ahead. Hannah had just finished packing her father's documents more securely for the ride to town when the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Matthew was on his feet instantly, hand moving to his sidearm. "Stay inside," he instructed, moving to the window to peer out. "Who is it?" Hannah asked, joining him despite his warning. Through the window, they could see 5 riders approaching Sheriff Thompson at the lead, with 2 of Prescott's men and 2 strangers whose city clothes marked them as outsiders. "The sheriff," Matthew said grimly, "and company. This can't be good." Hannah straightened her shoulders, tucking the packet of papers into her skirt pocket. "Let's hear what they have to say." They stepped onto the porch together as the riders reached the yard. Sheriff Thompson, a portly man with a perpetually sour expression, dismounted first. "Miss Davis," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. "Seems you've had some trouble here." "As if you didn't know," Hannah replied coldly. "What do you want, Sheriff?" Thompson's eyes narrowed at her tone. "I'm here on official business." "These gentlemen," he gestured to the well-dressed strangers, "are representatives of the Northern Pacific Railroad. They've lodged a formal complaint regarding your interference with approved railroad development." One of the railroad men stepped forward, a document in his hand. "Miss Davis, I'm Robert Williams, legal counsel for Northern Pacific. We have reason to believe you're deliberately obstructing vital infrastructure development by refusing reasonable compensation for your property." Hannah felt Matthew tense beside her. "There's nothing reasonable about burning down a woman's barn to force her off her land," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. The lawyer looked uncomfortable. "Northern Pacific categorically denies any involvement in property damage or intimidation tactics." "Of course you do," Hannah said. "Just as I'm sure Mr. Prescott denies it as well, despite the fact that his men threatened me directly not 24 hours before my property mysteriously caught fire." Sheriff Thompson interjected. "Now, Miss Davis, making accusations without proof is a serious matter." "Mr. Prescott is a respected businessman. We have proof," Matthew cut in. "Witness statements, documentation of previous threats, and the testimony of a dozen townspeople who have experienced similar intimidation." This clearly caught the sheriff off guard. He exchanged a glance with the railroad men, who appeared equally surprised. "In fact," Hannah added, emboldened by Matthew's support, "we're on our way to present this evidence to Judge Harmon today. I'm sure he'll be very interested to learn about the railroad's business practices in Bannack." The second railroad representative, an older man with a carefully trimmed beard, stepped forward. "Perhaps we've gotten off on the wrong foot. Miss Davis, my name is Edward Thornton, Senior Acquisitions Manager for Northern Pacific. If there have been irregularities in the negotiation process, we want to address them." "Irregularities," Hannah repeated incredulously. "Is that what you call arson and threats?" Thornton had the grace to look uncomfortable. "If such actions have been taken, they were not authorized by Northern Pacific. Our company operates within the law." "Then you should be very concerned about your local representative," Matthew said, "because Wilson Prescott has been operating well outside it." A tense silence followed. Sheriff Thompson shifted his weight, clearly uncertain how to proceed now that Hannah and Matthew had revealed their hand. Finally, Thornton spoke again. "Miss Davis, what if I were to offer you a new proposal directly from Northern Pacific without Mr. Prescott's involvement? Double the original offer, plus compensation for the damaged structures." Hannah was momentarily stunned by the figure, which would be enough to establish her comfortably anywhere else in the territory. But the thought of abandoning her father's dream of letting Prescott win through violence and intimidation strengthened her resolve. "My land is not for sale," she said firmly. "Not for any price." Thornton frowned. "Miss Davis, I urge you to reconsider. The railroad will come through this area one way or another. If not through your land, then around it, leaving you isolated, cut off from markets and supplies. Your ranch would become virtually worthless." It was a sobering thought, one Hannah hadn't fully considered. She felt Matthew's hand brush against hers, a subtle gesture of support. "Then build around my land," she said. "I'm not stopping progress, Mr. Thornton. I'm stopping theft disguised as progress." The railroad men exchanged glances, clearly not prepared for this level of resistance. Sheriff Thompson, sensing the shift in dynamics, attempted to reassert control of the situation. "Well, this has been informative," he said, "but I also came to investigate reports of a fire. As sheriff, it's my duty to determine if any laws were broken." "How dedicated of you," Matthew remarked dryly. "Especially considering Hannah reported fence cutting and cattle rustling 3 times this summer with no response from your office." The sheriff flushed. "Mind your tone, Cowboy. I can still arrest you for interfering with an investigation." "On what grounds?" Hannah challenged. "Matthew works for me. He has every right to be here." Before the confrontation could escalate further, the sound of more approaching riders drew everyone's attention. To Hannah's surprise, it was Jenkins the blacksmith, accompanied by Mr. Collins from the newspaper and 3 other townsmen. Jenkins reined in his horse, surveying the scene with evident suspicion. "Everything all right here, Miss Davis?" "We saw the smoke from town yesterday evening, but by the time we organized to ride out, it was too dark to travel safely." Hannah felt a surge of gratitude at this unexpected show of support. "These gentlemen were just leaving," she said, looking pointedly at the sheriff and the railroad representatives. Collins dismounted, notebook already in hand. "Sheriff Thompson, what a coincidence finding you here. I'd love a statement about how you're investigating this obvious case of arson against Miss Davis." The sheriff's expression darkened. "There's no evidence of arson, Collins. could have been an accident. An accident that conveniently occurred right after Miss Davis began gathering support in town against Prescott's tactics. Collins shook his head, scribbling in his notebook. My readers will find that quite the coincidence. Thornton, sensing that the situation had shifted beyond his control, turned to Hannah with a final appeal. Miss Davis, please consider our offer. We're prepared to negotiate in good faith. Your good faith comes too late, Mr. Thornton, Hannah replied. If Northern Pacific wants to discuss terms in the future, you can speak to my attorney after Judge Harmon has reviewed the evidence of intimidation and arson we're presenting today. Recognizing defeat, at least for the moment, the railroad men mounted their horses. Sheriff Thompson, clearly uncomfortable with the growing number of witnesses, followed suit. This isn't over, Miss Davis, he warned as he turned his horse. Obstructing the railroad has consequences. So does burning a woman's property, Jenkins called after him. And some of us are watching now, Sheriff. As the unwelcome visitors rode away, Hannah turned to Jenkins and the others in amazement. You came all this way to help, Jenkins dismounted, his massive frame making the gesture seem surprisingly graceful. Course we did. When we saw the smoke, we knew what it meant. Took longer than I'd have liked to gather a group, but we're here now. He gestured to the burned barn. And by the looks of it, you could use some help rebuilding. Collins nodded in agreement. Most of us have experience with barn raising. With enough hands, we could have you a new structure before the first snow. Hannah was momentarily speechless, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness. Matthew stepped forward, extending his hand to Jenkins. We appreciate the help more than you know, he said. But first, Hannah needs to get these documents to Judge Harmon. Jenkins grinned. That's why we brought extra horses. Some of us will stay here, start clearing the debris and preparing for rebuilding. Others can escort you to town safety in numbers, especially now that you've riled up both Prescott and the railroad. For the first time since discovering the fire, Hannah felt a genuine sense of hope. This was more than just support for her fight against Prescott, it was community, something she had almost forgotten existed in her years of solitary struggle. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. All of you. Within the hour, Hannah and Matthew were riding toward Bannack, accompanied by Collins and one of the other townsmen, a former Army scout named Taylor who knew the terrain better than most. The remaining volunteers had stayed behind to begin the cleanup, promising to guard the property in their absence. Your story has spread through town like wildfire, Collins told them as they rode. Prescott's always had enemies, but most were too afraid to stand against him alone. You've given people courage, Miss Davis. I never intended to start a movement, Hannah said honestly. I just wanted to keep my home. Sometimes that's all it takes, the newspaper editor replied, one person refusing to be bullied, inspiring others to do the same. They reached Bannack without incident, heading straight for the hotel where Judge Harmon was staying. To their relief, he agreed to see them immediately, listening with grave attention as Hannah presented the documents proving her ownership and the written statements they'd gathered the previous day. This is deeply troubling, the judge said when she had finished. Especially the involvement of the sheriff, who should be protecting citizens rather than enabling their harassment. He examined the scorched edges of one document, evidence of its narrow escape from the fire. I'll issue an injunction today prohibiting any further attempts to coerce you from your property, Miss Davis, and I'll send a telegram to the territorial governor requesting an investigation into Sheriff Thompson's conduct. What about Prescott? Matthew asked. He's the one behind all this. Judge Harmon's expression was severe. If you can provide evidence directly linking him to the arson or threats, I'll issue a warrant for his arrest immediately. Without that, the injunction is the strongest legal protection I can offer for now. It wasn't everything they'd hoped for, but it was a start. With the judge's injunction in hand, they made their next stop at the newspaper office, where Collins began composing an article detailing both the harassment Hannah had faced and the community's response. This will be front page tomorrow, he promised. Every settler for 50 miles will know what happened and what Prescott tried to do. Their final task was to visit the telegraph office, where Hannah spent a significant portion of her savings sending a detailed message to the Northern Pacific headquarters in St. Paul, Minnesota. The telegram outlined the coercive tactics used in the railroad's name and formally requested an investigation into Wilson Prescott's methods. "They may ignore it," she acknowledged to Matthew as they left the office, "but at least we've created a record of the complaint." "They won't ignore it," Matthew said confidently. "Railroads are sensitive about their public image, especially now when they're trying to secure land grants from Congress. Bad publicity is the last thing they want." By late afternoon, they had accomplished everything they'd set out to do in town. As they prepared to return to the ranch, Hannah felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. The day's events had changed everything. She was no longer fighting alone against an overwhelming force. She had allies, legal protection, and most importantly, she had Matthew. The thought of him brought a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. In the chaos of fire and confrontation, she hadn't had time to fully process what had happened between them the night before the kiss, the unspoken acknowledgement of feelings that had grown with surprising speed. "Ready to head back?" Matthew asked, interrupting her thoughts as he finished securing their supplies to the saddle. Hannah nodded, mounting her horse with practiced ease. "More than ready. I want to see how much progress they've made on the barn." The ride back was peaceful, a welcome contrast to the tension of the past 2 days. As they crested the final hill overlooking the ranch, Hannah gasped in surprise. Below them, at least a dozen men were working on the barn site, clearing debris, preparing lumber, raising the beginnings of a new frame. Women from town had arrived as well, setting up a cooking area where they prepared food for the workers. "I don't believe it," she whispered. Matthew smiled, watching the scene with equal amazement. "Seems Jenkins has been busy rallying support." They rode down to the ranch, greeted by cheers from the workers as they arrived. Jenkins approached, wiping sweat from his brow. "We've made good progress," he announced proudly. "Should have the frame completed by nightfall, and if this many folks return tomorrow, we might have you a functional barn by the end of the week." Hannah dismounted, taking in the transformation of her property from scene of destruction to hub of community effort. "I don't know how to thank you all," she said, her voice carrying to the assembled workers. "No need for thanks," Jenkins replied. "Prescott and his railroad have pushed us all around for too long. Standing together against him benefits everyone in Bannack." As evening approached, the workers began to disperse, promising to return the next day. Mrs. Parker, who had arrived with food for the volunteers, approached Hannah before leaving. "A word of warning, dear," she said quietly. "Prescott was in a rage when he heard about your visit to Judge Harmon. He's not going to take this defeat lightly." Hannah nodded, appreciating the older woman's concern. "We'll be careful, and we're not alone anymore." "No, you certainly aren't," Mrs. Parker agreed, her gaze shifting meaningfully to Matthew, who was discussing the barn plans with Jenkins nearby. "That's a good man you found, Hannah, the kind who stands his ground when it matters." Hannah felt her cheeks warm. "He's been a tremendous help." Mrs. Parker smiled knowingly. "I'm sure he has." She patted Hannah's arm affectionately before departing. "Get some rest, dear. Tomorrow will be another busy day." As night fell, Hannah and Matthew sat on the porch of the damaged house, watching the stars emerge above the partially constructed barn frame. The day's events had left them physically exhausted but spiritually renewed. "I never expected any of this," Hannah admitted, gesturing toward the barn. "All these people coming together to help. People respect courage," Matthew replied, "and you've shown plenty of that." Hannah turned to face him, her expression serious. "We never talked about what happened last night," she said. "With everything else going on, there hasn't been time," Matthew finished for her. He reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "But I meant what I said, Hannah. I'm here because I want to be. Because in just these few days, you've come to matter to me in a way no one has in a very long time." The honesty in his voice made her heart race. "This has all happened so quickly," she said. "A week ago, I was alone, facing what seemed like an impossible fight. And then you appeared, and everything changed." "Sometimes life works that way," Matthew said softly. My father used to say that the most important journeys often begin with an unexpected turn in the road. Hannah smiled at the sentiment. Mine said something similar, that God puts people in our path when we need them most. She hesitated, then added, I'm grateful he put you in mine, Matthew. In the silvery moonlight, his expression was tender as he leaned toward her. This time, when their lips met, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only the certainty of two people who had found something precious in each other, against all odds. The next week passed in a blur of activity. True to Jenkins' prediction, the barn frame was completed by the end of the first day, and by the end of the week, a new barn stood where the charred ruins had been smaller than the original but sturdy and serviceable. The house repairs progressed more slowly but steadily, with Matthew leading the effort to replace the damaged roof and walls. The community support continued to surprise Hannah. Families she barely knew brought food, supplies, and willing hands. Children helped gather the remaining cattle, which had gradually returned to familiar grazing grounds. Even the local pastor arrived one day with 3 church members to help with repairs and offer a blessing for the rebuilt structures. Meanwhile, Collins' newspaper article had created exactly the stir they'd hoped for. The detailed account of Prescott's tactics, combined with the story of the community's response, had turned public opinion decisively against the land baron. Several other property owners came forward with their own stories of intimidation, lending further credibility to Hannah's claims. Most surprising of all was the telegram that arrived 5 days after Hannah had sent her complaint to Northern Pacific headquarters. The message was brief but significant. Prescott's authority revoked. Stop investigation underway. Stop company representative arriving next week to negotiate fair settlement. Stop. They actually listened, Hannah marveled, reading the telegram for the 3rd time. I never really believed they would. Matthew, who had just returned from helping with the final touches on the barn, smiled at her amazement. Like I said, railroads care about their reputation. Once they realized what Prescott was doing in their name, they had to act. But what does this mean for us, for the ranch? It means you've won, Matthew said simply. They'll have to find another route for their tracks or negotiate terms that actually benefit you. Hannah should have felt only triumph at this news, but an unexpected melancholy crept in as well. With the immediate threat gone and the rebuilding well underway, Matthew would have no reason to stay. Their week had stretched to nearly 2, but eventually he would move on, as he always had before. The thought must have shown on her face, because Matthew's expression softened as he stepped closer. What's troubling you? This is good news. Hannah hesitated, then decided on honesty. I was just thinking that once everything's settled, you'll be moving on. Finding that land you've been saving for. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by something that looked remarkably like relief. Is that what you think? That I'm planning to leave? Isn't that what you do? Hannah asked. You said yourself you've never stayed anywhere long. Matthew took her hands in his gaze steady and sincere. Hannah Davis, the moment I saw you defending your land, something changed in me. I've spent years drifting, looking for something I couldn't name. I think I was looking for a place to belong, or maybe someone to belong with. Hannah's heart quickened at his words. What are you saying, Matthew? I'm saying I don't want to leave, he replied simply. Not tomorrow, not next week, not ever if you'll have me. He smiled, a touch of nervousness showing through his usual confidence. I know it's fast, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Joy bloomed within Hannah's chest, so intense it almost hurt. I don't want you to leave either, she admitted. These past 2 weeks have shown me what it's like to have someone by my side, someone who stands with me instead of trying to change me or control me. I don't want to go back to being alone. Matthew's smile widened as he pulled her gently into his arms. Then it's settled. I'm staying. Just like that? Hannah asked, hardly daring to believe it could be so simple. Just like that, he confirmed. Though I should warn you, I do plan to build my own place eventually. Nothing fancy, but something that's ours, not just yours, that I've moved into. Ours, Hannah repeated, liking the sound of the word. I think my father would have approved. He always said this land needed more than one person to make it thrive. Matthew laughed softly. Smart man, your father. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch tender. I found you defending your land alone, Hannah Davis, but if I have anything to say about it, you'll never have to stand alone again." Hannah stretched up on her toes to kiss him, feeling a sense of rightness and completion that she had never expected to find. When they finally separated, she smiled up at him, eyes shining with happiness and unshed tears. "I'm holding you to that promise, Cowboy." The confrontation with Prescott came sooner than they expected. 2 days after the telegram from Northern Pacific arrived, Hannah and Matthew returned from checking fence lines to find him waiting at the newly rebuilt barn, alone for once. "Miss Davis," he greeted her, his tone carefully neutral. "Mr. Stone." Hannah tensed, but Matthew's steady presence beside her gave her courage. "Mr. Prescott," she replied coolly, "I assume you've heard from your employers." A flicker of anger crossed Prescott's face before he mastered it. "Former employers," he corrected. "It seems Northern Pacific has decided on a change of representation in this territory." "Can't imagine why," Matthew remarked dryly. Prescott ignored the comment, focusing on Hannah. "I've come to propose a truce, Miss Davis. What's done is done, but we still have to live in the same community." "I'm willing to put our disagreements behind us if you are." Hannah studied him skeptically. "A truce? After you burned my barn and threatened my livelihood?" "I admit my methods were overzealous," Prescott conceded, though his expression suggested he felt no genuine remorse. "Business is business, but perhaps I crossed a line." "Perhaps," Matthew echoed incredulously. Hannah placed a restraining hand on his arm. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Prescott?" "Simply this. I drop any claim to your land, you drop your complaints against me with Judge Harmon and the territorial governor. We both move forward." Hannah considered the offer. With Northern Pacific withdrawing their support, Prescott had lost much of his leverage. The injunction from Judge Harmon protected her legally, and public opinion had turned decisively against the land baron. She was, for all practical purposes, safe from further harassment. But the memory of her burning barn, of the fear and helplessness she had felt that night, remained vivid. To let Prescott walk away without consequences seemed wrong. "I can't do that," she said finally. "Not after everything that's happened. The judge's investigation will proceed, Mr. Prescott. If you're found guilty of ordering the arson or other crimes, you'll face the consequences." Prescott's facade of civility cracked. "You're making a mistake," he warned. "I still have influence in this territory. Things could become difficult for you, for both of you." Matthew stepped forward, his voice dangerously quiet. "Are you threatening us, Prescott?" "Because that didn't work out so well for you last time." The land baron's eyes narrowed as he assessed the couple before him. Whatever he saw in their united stance must have convinced him further threats would be useless. With a curt nod, he turned to leave. "You've won this round, Miss Davis," he said over his shoulder. "Enjoy it while you can." They watched him ride away, the tension in Hannah's shoulders easing only when he disappeared from sight. "Do you think he'll try something else?" she asked Matthew. He shook his head. "Not directly. He's lost too much already, his railroad contract, his reputation. He'll lick his wounds and find other ways to make money." He slipped an arm around her waist. "And if he does try anything, he'll find we're ready for him." Hannah leaned into his embrace, drawing strength from his confidence. "We certainly are." The following weeks brought a series of positive developments. Judge Harmon's investigation into the arson progressed, with 2 of Prescott's former employees providing testimony in exchange for reduced charges in their own cases. While Prescott himself managed to avoid direct implication, the evidence was enough to further damage his standing in the community. The new representative from Northern Pacific arrived as promised, a straightforward businessman named Howard Grant, who approached negotiations with Hannah in good faith. After several meetings, they reached an agreement that satisfied both parties. The railroad would build its line along the southern edge of her property, far from the house and main grazing lands. In exchange, Hannah would receive fair compensation for the land used, water rights for her cattle from the railroad's wells, and guaranteed transportation rates for her livestock to markets east. "I think your father would approve of this arrangement," Matthew said as they reviewed the final contract together. "It preserves the heart of the ranch while securing its future." Hannah nodded, tracing the boundary lines on the survey map. It's a good compromise. We get the benefits of the railroad without sacrificing what matters most. The word "we" came naturally now, a reflection of how completely Matthew had integrated into her life and plans. Though they had known each other barely a month, it felt as if he had always been part of the ranch part of her. His quiet strength complemented her determination, his practical skills filled gaps in her own capabilities, and his unwavering support gave her a confidence she had never known before. One evening in late October, as they sat on the newly repaired porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, Matthew broached a subject they had danced around for days. "I've been thinking about our future," he said, his voice casual though Hannah could sense an undercurrent of nervousness. "About building that place of our own." Hannah turned to him, curious. "You've mentioned that before. Did you have something specific in mind?" Matthew nodded, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a folded piece of paper. "I sketched some ideas," he said, unfolding it to reveal a rough but detailed drawing of a house. "Nothing fancy but solid. 2 stories, plenty of room for a family someday. Built right where your father planted those oak saplings by the creek." Hannah studied the drawing, touched by the care he had put into it and the implications of his planning. A home built for a family, their family. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "But Matthew, are you sure this is what you want? A month ago you were still drifting, looking for your own place. Now you're talking about settling here permanently." Matthew took her hand, his expression earnest. "I've never been more certain of anything," he assured her. "Hannah, I know it's been quick, but I love you. I love this land. I love the life we've started building together." The declaration, though not unexpected given how close they had grown, still sent a thrill through Hannah's heart. "I love you too," she replied, the words feeling right and natural. "And I want that future with you, the house, the family, all of it." Matthew's smile was radiant as he leaned in to kiss her, a gentle touch that conveyed all the emotion words couldn't express. When they separated, he reached into his pocket again, this time withdrawing a small silver ring. "It was my mother's," he explained, holding it out to her. "I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right person, the right moment. I can't offer you wealth or an easy life, Hannah, but I can promise to stand beside you through whatever comes, to help build the dreams your father started and add new ones of our own." His eyes held hers, filled with love and hope. "Will you marry me?" Hannah's vision blurred with tears as she nodded, too overwhelmed for words initially. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, Matthew, I will." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit that seemed like another sign of rightness, Hannah felt a sense of completion. The past month had brought challenges she could never have imagined facing alone, but it had also brought Matthew a partner who had stood beside her when she needed it most, and who now promised to remain there for the rest of their days. "My father used to say that the land chooses its people as much as people choose the land," she told Matthew as they sat together, her head resting on his shoulder, the ring catching the last rays of sunset. "I think maybe it chose both of us, brought us together when we needed each other most." Matthew smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I like that idea," he said, "that some things are meant to be even when they seem to happen by chance." As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, planning their future together, the house they would build, the ranch they would expand, the family they hoped to raise. The struggles of recent weeks had forged a bond between them that neither had expected, but both treasured beyond measure. In the years that followed, the ranch flourished under their joint care. The railroad brought the promised benefits without disrupting their way of life. The new house was built by the creek, though they maintained the original cabin as well, eventually converting it into a home for the ranch foreman they hired as their operations expanded. Their family grew with the arrival of a son in their second year of marriage, a sturdy boy they named James after Hannah's father. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, and eventually a second son, Thomas. The children grew up strong and capable, learning to love the land as their parents did. Prescott's influence in Bannack gradually waned, though he never faced criminal charges for the arson. He eventually sold most of his holdings and moved east, his departure bringing a collective sigh of relief from the community he had dominated for so long. Hannah and Matthew's story became something of a local legend, how a lone cowboy had found a woman defending her land against impossible odds, had stood beside her when all seemed lost, and had never left again. It was a tale told around Bannack's hearths on winter evenings, a reminder that sometimes courage and love could overcome even the most daunting challenges. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Matthew surprised Hannah with a bench placed beneath the now mature oak trees where they had built their home. Carved into the wood was a simple inscription, "Where two hearts found home." As they sat together that evening, watching their children play in the fading light, Hannah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From the desperate loneliness of defending her father's legacy alone to the rich fullness of the life they now shared, every step had led to this place of contentment and belonging. "Any regrets?" Matthew asked, his arm around her shoulders, the years having only deepened the bond between them. Hannah shook her head, leaning into his embrace. "Not one," she said honestly. "How could I regret anything that brought us here?" The ranch continued to thrive through the changing seasons of their lives. As Bannack grew from frontier settlement to established town, Hannah and Matthew remained respected fixtures in the community, known for their fairness, generosity, and unwavering commitment to each other and the land they loved. Their children eventually brought grandchildren, ensuring the Davis Stone Ranch would continue for generations to come. The house Matthew had built with such care expanded to accommodate family gatherings, its walls absorbing the laughter, tears, and stories that made up the fabric of their shared history. And through it all, Hannah and Matthew remained as they had begun side by side, partners in all things, their love a steady flame that neither time nor trials could diminish. On quiet evenings, they still sat together on the porch Matthew had built, watching the sun set over the Montana landscape that had brought them together. Sometimes they spoke of the future, of plans for the ranch and hopes for their grandchildren. Sometimes they reminisced about the past, the fire, the confrontation with Prescott, the community that had rallied around them in their time of need. But most often, they simply enjoyed the peace of being together, secure in the knowledge that what they had found in each other was rare and precious, a love born in adversity, strengthened through shared purpose, and sustained by mutual respect and unwavering commitment. "I found you defending your land alone," Matthew would sometimes say, echoing the words he had spoken on that pivotal day so many years before. "And I never want you to stand alone again." "I never have," Hannah would reply, her hand finding his with the ease of long familiarity. "Not since the day you rode onto my land and decided to stay." And in that simple truth lay the essence of their story, a cowboy who had found a woman defending her land alone, had stood beside her when she needed it most, and had never left again. It wasn't just a tale told around Bannack's hearths. It was their life, their legacy, their love. A journey that had begun with an unexpected meeting and had led to a lifetime of shared dreams, realized together on the land they both called home.